Hello. I have a very daunting challenge here because I'm between you and the reception. So I hope that the story I come to share with you is captivating. And I'm really delighted to share the stage with such amazing narratives and storytellers and an audience out there that I know is also very good at creating narratives. So let me start off by saying that narratives are important and they're very powerful. We are hardwired to understand the world and to learn through narratives and through storytelling. And done right, narratives are about empowering and validation and shining a light on what works. But there's another side to it, because narratives can also be about entrenching a specific world vision, about validating what we already want to validate. Think confirmation bias. We tend to look for confirmation of what we already believe. Or think status quo bias. We tend to go for the default option. We don't want to rock the boat. And there's deep lessons there for where we are right now and for the agendas that we are trying to move. So I wanted to share with you a story from that SDG journey that was alluded to. So back in 2010, as some of us were starting to think about the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, Rio +20, we were faced with an agenda that had been defined, which was incredibly bureaucratic and mattered to no one. And this at a moment when we already saw that as humans, we were breaching every single planetary boundary, and we had no plan for action. We had no call for action. So Colombia, we looked around and thought, what has worked? And there's thousands of resolutions, of decisions, of decade of this and year of that, and none of that has moved the needle. Actually, the only thing that we saw that really had galvanized action were the MDGs. And they had actually created a very powerful narrative about collective action for eradicating poverty and collective action for tackling some of the most pressing social issues. And it had worked. So we said, let's build on the MDGs. Let's move that forward. But the MDGs were not up for the task. We needed a new framework because the MDGs were narrow and they were disconnected and not up to the task of the complexities of development. Importantly, they were only addressing also developing nations and not really tackling the 1% of humanity that consumes the majority of the world's resources. And that doesn't work, and that's not equitable. So Colombia proposed that in Rio +20, countries of the world adopt this thing called the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. But I want to underline that the SDGs were not inevitable. We created a narrative, we created an agenda, a metric about a functional, integrated, equitable world in which everybody, all countries, all peoples had to step up and change. And this posed a threat to many. It was widely dismissed, and those that did not dismiss it as an absurd proposition hated it. Developed countries hated it because the MDGs was a discrete and simple agenda that was easy to address, and it did not involve them. And developing countries hated it because they were fearful that the MDGs would simply die out and that there were all sorts of perverse conditionalities embedded in the SDG agenda. So changing a narrative is difficult, and this was a revolutionary narrative. So there's two lessons from that. The first, don't give up. Be relentless when you want to have a narrative that really changes the paradigm, and be bold. For months, Colombia was in the wilderness. We walked the halls of the UN and had proposals, propositions, working groups, trying to galvanize that action. And we never, ever gave up. And guess what? Slowly, there started to be a buzz. Slowly, countries, constituents, colleagues started to come forward and to embrace it. Then, in August, Guatemala endorsed it. So finally, it was 2 countries. And then other countries endorsed it. And then in November, enough countries had told the UN that they wanted the SDGs, that they were part of the negotiating text for Rio+20. And that's what clinched it. That's when the SDGs were really starting to be born. So what was important about this was that the Colombian proposal, then Guatemala, with Peru, with UAE, with everybody that joined, all the constituencies, all the groups that joined and supported, we called out the MDGs for what they were. An agenda that had galvanized amazing action, but it was still an agenda that was minimal and not up to the complexities of development. What we dared to imagine, and that was the dramatic new narrative, was a world in which there was a spectrum of development, in which all countries, all peoples, had a place in that development spectrum and had their own challenges and had their own opportunities. But it was also a revolution in responsibility, because it meant that all peoples and all countries also had to step up to act, very much along the lines of what Hillary was saying at the very beginning in her first intervention. It was an acknowledgement that unless we all acted together, we were not going to be able to ensure the long-term well-being of people and planet. And that, at that moment, was a revolution. That was then clinched a couple of years, or if you're looking at 2015, a couple of months later, with Paris, which reinforced that agenda, the idea of an agenda of universal equity. But I want to underline, as we gather in the GLF, as across the town they gather at the UN, that these are all fascinating, powerful agendas, but they are still promises, and we have to turn them into action. So how do we move from narrative to impact, to that implementation that we want? Very much along the call that Hillary had at the beginning. We already have, for many decades, a toolkit, a traditional toolkit that we use. So to change practices and behaviors, we write laws, we levy fines when there's bad behavior, we provide material rewards for good behavior, we do a lot of campaigns and awareness raising. And mind you, all of that is really good, and it's very necessary, but it's not enough. Because at the heart of RARE's proposition is that we are not homo economicus, that behavior science teaches us that we are very much driven, not by logic and not by reason. That if we want to change people's minds, we have to change people's hearts. We need to have a completely different approach that builds and understands what makes this weird species, human beings, actually think and behave. And that's what RARE has done. We're bringing together and proposing a toolkit that can enhance that traditional toolkit that we have, but really founded on what makes human beings tick. So let me share with you 5 simple elements of that toolkit. The first is that if people are the problem, they are also the solution. Secondly, emotions are far more powerful than reason. Look at the wonderful narratives that our colleagues have shared and the emotions they arise and how that really captivates us. We are social animals. We model ourselves on those that we trust. So changing individual behavior is also about changing social norms. How choices are designed matters. Remember that status quo bias that I mentioned at the beginning? We tend to go for the default option. Imagine if working together we could make it so that the default option is a sustainable option. And most important, the key to all of this, to unlocking this potential, is empowered local communities, which fortunately is something that we have seen resonating in the discussions in these halls for today, and I know tomorrow will be the same. So RARE is taking that approach. We have several programs around the world, but we're embarking on an interesting journey in Colombia, applying this behavioral science to agricultural practices and land use. We're embarking in a peace process in Colombia, and that often opens huge possibilities for radical ways of supporting rural communities. But it is also urgently a need to change social norms. And let me just give you one example. Say the word baldío. If you say baldío to any Colombian, the image that comes to mind immediately is of a useless wasteland, unproductive, with which you have to do something. Well, baldíos are actually our natural lands, the ones that everybody wants to visit, unique ecosystems of amazing biodiversity. But Colombians have been taught that unless humans intervene to make the land productive, it is not productive. So how do you change that? And changing that is vital. It's changing practices, expectations, technical assistance, and mindsets. And that's what we want to set out to do. That's what we're doing in Colombia. We're also, in these times of transition, behavioral sciences teaches us that it's a unique opportunity for turning things around. So we want, and we're working with front runners, with the leaders, with farmers, with extension services that have catalyzed and identified what are the practices and the shifts, and bringing in behavioral sciences to take it to scale, to replicate, to take it to other communities, to inform decision makers. I would just like to finalize by saying that for me, changing the narrative is really not about looking at what is possible, but about really shifting and understanding what is needed and then how to make it happen. It's very much along the lines of what our friends from South Africa have shared. I think we have to really use narratives to be radical. And right now, in the juncture where we are right now, that is the call that we must heed. Using the narratives to be as radical as we can, to bring about and fast-track the solutions that we need in a way that there's real uptake and that really resonates. And that's what will ensure that nature and people thrive today and tomorrow. Thank you.